UNODC has released two reports on cybercrime situation in Southeast Asia in 2024. What are your findings and the key points of the cybercrime in Southeast Asia?
We've basically seen two broad trends through the research that we have been doing. One has been the way that this cybercrime, this cyber scam industry has developed from starting out as basically a casino industry set up in the region for money laundering, moving into the online space then and sort of adapting technologies that were becoming available rapidly over the past years, and then really turning into this scam industry that we've now been seeing in Southeast Asia for the past few years. The second big trend that we've been seeing is the way that the different actors that are involved in this kind of activities are working together. So rather than having, individual kind of syndicates or criminal groups organizing the entire framework that they're working in, we are having a broad range of different actors coming into this ecosystem and providing services to the criminal actors. So it's really been turned into a kind of a criminal service economy. And what that has done is create the basis for increased innovation and increasingly rapid innovation, adoption of new technologies, adoption of things like cryptocurrencies at a very rapid rate. And that's really concerning from our perspective. These amounts are really massive. If you look at them as a whole, they're really big. But if you look at them as individual cases, I mean, these are all individual people in Thailand, in the region, who are defrauded. These are like families who basically lose all their savings, all their money. And if you look at it from these individual perspectives, it becomes even more concerning. But then again, taking the overall amount, I mean, it's really almost a macroeconomic factor. It really it's an economic factor in many parts of the region. We're seeing amounts involved, whether it's on the scamming or on the money laundering, that are often bigger than GDPs of entire countries in the region. So it's really significant. And then on top of that, we also need to understand that these scam operations in the region here, they do not just affect the region here, but they increasingly target people outside of the region as well. So the money that is being made globally is really significant and really worrying. Well, there are different ways to go about it. But before we even get to that, it's really important to understand that this is a really complex issue to address. Some of the trends that we've been seeing really, the way that technology is integrated, new technologies that, often in other parts of the economies even aren't being used yet, make it really difficult to address some of these things. So when we're talking about the challenges of the region to address them, countries in the region to address these threats, that's a really important thing to understand. But there are ways to address it, and one really important area is the question of regulation. This really started out as a very unregulated casino industry that had grown in the region over the years. And it was allowed to grow in many countries in the region just because there was no regulatory framework. These were basically illegal casinos, very limited regulation in some countries. And this allowed this industry to grow, and we're seeing a lack of regulation across different sectors. And what these criminal groups are really good at is using those loopholes, these limitations that we're seeing in the regulatory frameworks. And then the other problem is, even where we are seeing better regulatory frameworks, it's a question of enforcing them, because the best regulation won't help you if you cannot enforce it. And that's also where corruption plays a big role. If we look at the history of this issue in the region, in Southeast Asia, and especially the Mekong, we've traditionally seen how criminal groups have used casinos really effectively for their purposes. Now, in many cases, these casinos really existed in a regulatory vacuum. So anyone who is thinking about putting in place casinos would really need to look at it from the very beginning, look at the regulatory framework, look at the enforcement capacity, look at the risk, the mitigation measures in place to manage the risks associated with something like this. The downside is that even in places that have a longer history of having an established casino industry and have quite good enforcement capacity, are still really struggling with issues of organized crime and money laundering. And taking this into account, together with the history that we've seen in many countries in the region, makes it really interesting to see the current developments and really important to see what the next steps will be that are put in place. You know, if you look at the map and where sort of the big centers sort of exist, it's true that, you know, many of them are along the border with Thailand, and there are different reasons for that. One is tied to the fact that these often grew out of casinos, which were often based on the other side of the Thai border, because it was for tourists to go from Thailand, whether it's Thai tourists or tourists from other parts of the world going to these countries, going into the casinos. And as technology has come in, and as we've seen more of the use of the online space, the use of Thai infrastructure also became an advantage for businesses that were based around Thailand. And then what we've seen from within Thailand is often Thailand being used also as a transit point, especially for people that are moved into these centers, people that are trafficked into these centers. And there's, again, good reasons for that. If you look at the overall number of people arriving in places like Bangkok's airports, and you combine that with the fact that a lot of the centers are close to Thailand, it makes a lot of sense to move people through Thailand. So, of course, that means Thailand has a role to play in addressing these things. But it's also a very complicated situation that Thailand finds itself. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it would probably be almost more different nationalities. Definitely, if you look across the region, I think we've seen more than 90 different nationalities involved. And especially when looking at Myawaddy, most of them would be transiting through Bangkok, through Thailand, simply because it's easier to reach Myawaddy from Thailand than from the Myanmar side these days. But it's a very complex question of how to address some of these flows, and I think we're seeing a lot of efforts being made to address these flows. But at the same time, it's very challenging to identify these people out of this overall number of people that come through Thailand every year. Well, what we're hoping to see more of is more international cooperation, especially within the region, more information sharing between the countries, which is critical to understand the trends and also identify individual cases of people coming into Thailand and going into other places. And we've seen quite a lot of efforts being made in Thailand, and the capacities in Thailand to address some of these things are actually quite advanced, especially compared to some of the other countries in the region. We've seen a lot of emphasis on money laundering investigation. We've seen a lot of emphasis on cybercrime investigations. But especially when it comes to managing that transit of people through Thailand, there's still a lot of efforts to be made, in particular in collaborating with the other countries where a lot of these people would come from. It's true, it's a global phenomenon, and global phenomena need, even though they look differently in different parts of the world, they also need big global solutions. And there are efforts by countries around the world to work towards sort of more coherent frameworks to address these things. Like just last year, at the end of last year, countries around the world agreed on a new cybercrime convention, which will actually put in place a framework for a lot of measures that would help to address not just concepts of cybercrime, but really very, very concrete ways in which cybercrime is committed in places like Myawaddy or in places like elsewhere in this region. So there are efforts towards this, but then to implement this framework really comes down to the different countries' willingness and capacity, right? And, you know, whether that's, you know, implementing measures on working together on criminal cases, for example, you know, being able to freeze and seize assets, for example, that were being generated from frauds. These are all, you know, very practical things that countries need to be able to do, and it's great to have this global framework, and which is being put in place. But at the same time, to take effective measures will really come down to each individual countries and how they cooperate, especially with their neighbors. It's really important to understand how good these groups are in bringing people to this region. And we've just recently seen a very prominent example of a Chinese citizen being trafficked through Thailand into Myanmar. And that comes after years of very significant efforts made by China, made by other countries in the region, to raise awareness of this issue. If you look back a few years, there was this movie, this Chinese movie, No More Bats, which really raised a lot of attention, and yet we continue to see people being trafficked there. So it's really difficult to get people, to prevent people from stepping into this trap. And the incentives that the criminal groups are using, whether it's jobs or whether it's other perspectives, these are really strong pull factors. So it's not an easy thing to raise awareness, but preventing this and raising awareness of it really needs to continue to be a priority for all the countries involved.